Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CJJA CSG webinar series. I'm Wendy Davis, Assistant Executive Director of CJJA. This is the second webinar in a six-part series. Today's webinar focuses on developing partnerships with key educational entities and workforce development providers. I would like to thank all of you for taking time to participate in today's webinar, and special thanks to our presenters who've put a great deal of work into the preparation of this webinar. Our speakers for today are Jacob Agus Kleiman, who is a policy analyst with the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Susan Lockwood-Roberts, who is the president of the Correctional Education Association and former director of Juvenile Education at the Indiana Department of Corrections. And we have Lucas Yax, who is the assistant superintendent of Residential and Juvenile Justice Youth School Program at Lighthouse Academy. You'll find their full bios as well as the on-track publication that will be referenced throughout the webinar in the handout box. For those of you who might be new to CJJA, we are a national nonprofit organization formed in 1994 to improve juvenile justice systems, local secure correctional and residential facilities, services, programs, and most importantly, long-term outcomes for youth and their families. CJJA represents state juvenile justice system CEOs in various local jurisdictions across the country. At this point, I'm going to ask Charity to share a few technical instructions before we start. Charity?
Good afternoon, everyone. If you could please use your audio through your phone and use your PIN number. Everyone will be muted during the webinar. Type questions anytime into the question bar. At the end, the CJJ training director will direct the questions towards the end of the webinar to Jacob. The webinar is being recorded. A link to the audio recording and PowerPoint presentation will be sent following the webinar. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Jacob.
Great. Thank you so much, Charity. I really appreciate CJJA's work in helping to bring this webinar series together, as well as everyone for joining. We know there's a lot going on in the world right now, and really appreciate everybody taking the time to come out and listen in on this webinar and participate. And we really hope that there will be some good conversation that comes through from this presentation. So on the next slide, for those of you who either did not attend the first webinar or it's been a few months and you don't remember, the Council of State Governments Justice Center is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that seeks to improve outcomes for those who come into contact with both the criminal and juvenile justice systems. We do that in a variety of different ways. We do that through providing technical assistance, independent research, as well as providing support to legislators and all three branches of government. However, as I mentioned, a key way that we help drive some change in reforms and improve the outcomes is through independent research into some gaps that we're seeing based off our technical assistance and work across the country. So for the next slide. One of the things that we were really seeing from our work in the juvenile justice system was that workforce development services and education services were becoming increasingly important for youth under community supervision. This is for a variety of different reasons. One is just poor outcomes. Approximately 50% of youth on probation and 65% of youth returning home from incarceration are rearrested within 1 year. Additionally, we know that the population is getting older. So in 1997, 62% of youth in facilities were 16 or older. By 2015, that number had risen to 69%. And of youth on probation, we see the same trends with almost half of youth who are on community supervision being 16 or older in 2016. And we know that those trends have continued to increase across the country. For example, in LA County, one of the largest juvenile justice systems in the country, the average age in their camps, which is their juvenile detention centers, was actually 17.9. And that's obviously led to a shift in the needs and service needs of this community. And as you can see, the youth facilities are now more likely to have a higher risk of reoffending. So one of the positives of the reform movement over the last decade is it has moved a number of youth out of the juvenile justice system and out of detention facilities in particular. But as a result, the youth who are left often have a higher risk of reoffending. They have fewer social supports. And when it comes to education, they're more likely to be overaged and undercredited. So as a result, the transition to independence and paid employment for these youth is increasingly important to successful reentry. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit. You can see that these challenges are especially pronounced when it comes to some of the education challenges that this population is dealing with. So prior to conducting the 50-state survey that we'll be discussing today and that launched this webinar series, CSG partnered with CJJA, I apologize, in 2015 to conduct a survey focused specifically around education titled Locked Out. And our research for that survey identified that over a third of incarcerated youth are identified as eligible for special education services, which is a rate nearly 4 times higher than youth attending school in the community. Additionally, over half of incarcerated youth have reading and math skills significantly below grade level, and as many as 60% have repeated a grade. And the majority of incarcerated youth were suspended or expelled from school, and many have dropped out of engaging with school entirely. And these are challenges that we know are going to be enhanced by the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, with schools going online, and a lot of research has come out that those individuals who are at the most risk are the ones who are losing the most educational value. We know that many youth don't have access to consistent internet. They don't have access to they don't have access to consistent tools to be able to complete online and distance learning. And some of these learning challenges are even more pronounced than they would be and require even greater attention to detail and greater activities in order to help support this population in improving their educational outcomes. So this COVID-19 pandemic is really driving home the need for this continued work. And specifically, as we talked about, as youth are getting older and are seeking transition to independence and seeking employment or higher education skills that will lead to pathways to improved careers, that's going to be even more difficult. We know that a justice-involved population is already struggling relative to the general population in getting employment. And it's often the first population to get hit by economic shocks, as we saw in 2008, and is the population that takes the longest to recover. So when thinking through how to make sure that both this juvenile justice population, young adult population isn't hit the hardest during the COVID-19 pandemic and also isn't left behind during the recovery, we really need to think through now more than ever the strategies and programs that can be put in place to ensure that this population is gaining access to high quality education and workforce development services that meet their needs. So next slide. This is even more critically important because we know that access to high quality education works. A meta-analysis of the RAND Corporation identified that when individuals participated in educational programs, they were 43% less likely to return to prison than those who participated in education or who did not participate in education or CTE programming. So we know that when provided with high quality services, it has a real impact. And that really does mean that it's more important than ever to think through how to make sure that those high quality services are being provided. Next slide. So to help meet this need and support jurisdictions that were beginning to work around this, we wanted to partner again with CJJA to look at more specifically career and technical education and education geared towards an older population that's looking to seek to independence, whether that's gaining GED or moving into higher education services. And so we partnered again to conduct another 50-state survey. We got responses from all 50 states. The survey questions focused on delivery of CTE and workforce services, partnerships with businesses, post-secondary institutions and workforce development agencies, reentry and employment connections, and then data collection and reporting. Next slide. And the survey was really designed to answer sort of 3 key questions. The first was around what workforce development services are provided to youth incarcerated in facilities and when they return to the community, and how those services are integrated into case and reentry planning. The second question asked about partnerships, so looking at who juvenile justice systems were partnering with in terms of workforce development agencies, educational entities, employers, in order to support youth. And the third question was around what data was collected and reported on and how that data was utilized to guide decision making. This presentation is going to focus more on that second question and specifically around education partnerships and educational entities and how those services are provided and supported both through funding sources as well as through data collection and partnerships. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the survey was designed to answer 3 key questions, and the second key finding was around the partnership delivery. And what we found was that most state juvenile correctional agencies lack the partnerships needed to help incarcerated youth overcome barriers to obtaining viable employment in the community. So as I mentioned, and as Wesley mentioned, this is going to be talking a little bit more about education partnerships. Today, we'll focus on more of the workforce and employer engagement partnerships in a future series of the webinar. But looking at the next slide. So when looking specifically at who state juvenile correctional agencies had formal partnerships with, what we found was that there was a large gap in how they were forming partnerships with educational entities. So as you can see, 40 states had some form of services with community colleges, only 28 with the state education agency, only 25 with technical or trade schools, and all the way down to only 20 states reporting partnerships with local education agencies. When we defined partnerships in this survey, we really focused on formal partnerships, so looking at, where MOUs in place, not relying on just individual staff members or individual probation officers to build those partnerships that could then go away with staff turnover, but really formalized strong partnerships. And what you can see from the community colleges is that what really was happening with individual facilities were building those partnerships, and it wasn't necessarily statewide. So maybe an individual facility would have a strong partnership with a local community college, but if you had a youth incarcerated in another part of the state, they may not have access to the same services. And you can really see that that breakdown in state-level partnerships and state-level guidance. In the local education agency partnerships, where only 20 states had those formalized partnerships with each local education agency. You do want to be clear that obviously different states have different systems. It may be possible that their juvenile justice schools were run by a statewide agency, which would then make a local education agency partnership a little redundant, so that there is some, wiggle room in the data, but overall the trends illustrated that the establishment of those formal partnerships wasn't really happening to the extent necessary to ensure that youth were receiving the right services and being linked to services upon reentry into the community. Next slide. And what you can see when looking at partnerships as a whole is that even when some partnerships existed, it wasn't necessarily across the board. So while we found that 39 states have partnerships with community college, only 30 of those states actually had partnerships with both community colleges and community-based organizations, and then only 20 of those states had partnerships with community colleges, community-based organizations, and employers. And this just really drives home the idea that there wasn't a lot of strategic thinking in the development of the full suite of partners necessary to make strong services available to this community. So while individual partnerships may exist and have been running well, there wasn't that vision of what will it take to make sure that every youth has access to all the services necessary to meet their needs. If you had a youth that was already getting their GED while in a facility and was looking for support around access to higher education and getting Pell Grant funds, there wasn't that partnership with a community-based organization to support that upon reentry into the community. Or if you had a youth that maybe had some work experience and was looking to build and connect to employers and help work through what it means to enter the workforce with a record and continue to move their career forward, there wasn't really those formal connections to help drive that. So the full suite of services, the full range of vision wasn't there and wasn't reflected, at least in the formal partnerships that states were reporting. Next slide. We also know that states face some really key barriers to being able to provide some of those key educational services. 9 states reported that they did not provide access to youth in their in their facilities to the internet. That was problematic even before in terms of being able to provide a range of services, but obviously in the time of COVID, that becomes even more pressing, as it's really impossible to provide educational services in facilities in a safe way if you're not providing distance-based learning skills. But even as we move forward from the COVID pandemic and groups are able to meet in smaller in-person settings, it still is extremely limiting in terms of what youth have access to and their ability to build the skills necessary to succeed further in their educational partnership as well as in their career. We also know that largely when it came to meeting the educational needs and especially the workforce development needs, states did not have a single staff member or single office that was responsible for overseeing programs and making sure that the programs were connecting to services in the community, that reentry and warm handoffs were happening as necessary to link youth back into their schools or into the community in a successful way, that statewide standards were being met. It was very disjointed. In some states, it may have been up to individual local school boards to oversee that. There may have been a statewide board. It may have just been on individual probation officers who are building those relationships and trying to make those warm handoffs. But largely it fell to staff who had a number of other responsibilities to, on top of those responsibilities, either provide quality assurance or technical assistance around education or support around reentry or building those relationships and formal partnerships. And because of that, that's why you saw in the partnership slide that there wasn't really the formal connections happening because there wasn't someone whose job it was to really drive those partnerships. And then even when partnerships did exist, due either to the people who had set those up leaving or a lack of formal quality assurance measures built in or procedures built into the partnerships that do exist, 36 states reported that their existing partnerships were either average, below average, or poor. So the partnerships that did exist, at least from the juvenile justice system, they didn't see as providing high quality services and a lot of value, either because the youth weren't being properly placed or because there wasn't the quality assurance or to make sure that the services met the standards, whether that was statewide education standards or statewide CTE standards, to make sure that the youth in the juvenile justice system were receiving the same high quality educational services. So a lot of really key barriers to making sure that this population is receiving those high quality services. On the next slide. And we know that some of that struggle comes from difficulties around resources, that it can be extremely difficult to provide. It's a resource-intensive population to work with. It's a difficult population to work with. But what we found was that part of the reason for this resource scarcity was that states were not utilizing the resources available to support some of these funding structures and some of these services. So, with the federal Perkins grant was highlighted, obviously Perkins 5 planning is happening right now. States can set aside up to 2% of funding to meet the needs of this population. That's a large percentage of the funding. It's increasing in Perkins 5 from previous Perkins grants, but only 26 states reported that they were utilizing federal Perkins grants money to support education and workforce development services for youth in the juvenile justice system. And while some of that may be because those funds were being utilized, but it was the person who was responding to the survey was not aware, this is something that should be 50 states are reporting that they're utilizing for Perkins grant money to support this population. And so to only see 50% was a really disappointing number. Similar for WIOA funds, only 11 states reported utilizing WIOA funds to support services for this population. And so really WIOA has set aside funding to allow for funding to go to a juvenile justice involved population, to an opportunity youth population, and to really support the services and high quality services for this population, and it just wasn't being utilized effectively to meet those needs. And then it's not on this slide, but another funding stream that we didn't specifically ask about, but we've heard isn't being utilized fully and that youth aren't being supported on is Second Chance Pell Grants. So Second Chance Pell can help youth who are moving into higher education access some funding because they may have, due to collateral consequences, an inability to get normal Pell Grants or financial aid from institutions or from the state. And so Second Chance Pell is designed to meet the financial needs of this population. And there wasn't a lot of reporting around supporting youth and applying for those Second Chance Pell Grants, utilizing those Second Chance Pell funds in order to support services for this population. Next slide, please. We also found through our conversations that states were not collecting key outcome data for youth in facilities. So this slide covers a range of different credentialing and education and workforce development services. So you see 37 states are collecting data on industry recognized credentials, but only 17 states were collecting data on post-secondary degrees or diplomas earned. And really focusing on that and the way it was impacting and going back to who is responsible within the system for making sure that youth are continuing to build and having those warm handoffs, is that if states aren't collecting data on what sort of degrees or diplomas are earned, not only is that a problem in terms of selecting what programs to provide, what programs are being effective, it also means that for that probation officer or that reentry case manager, if the youth or young adult isn't stating that they have received this degree or this diploma or are working towards that, for that reentry case plan, it then may not get incorporated. So you could have all of the time and effort and really high quality services could be provided to that youth, but then it's not being communicated, it's not being part of the reentry plan. And as a result, that all gets lost because no connection is made in the community to either leverage those skills learned or to make sure that it's completed if someone is close to completion. So the lack of data collection not only impacts the ability to make sure you're selecting high quality services, but it impacts the case planning and ability to make sure that youth aren't being provided just a series of separate services, but that they really build on each other and continue to build towards success. Next slide. And we see that lack of data collection reflected in the community as well. And we recognize, especially for juvenile justice systems, that it can be somewhat difficult to track some of this data in the community. When youth leave juvenile justice jurisdiction, it can be hard to follow up and see how things are occurring. And it's another reason that partnerships are really critical and building data sharing into those partnerships, because things around training certificates or credentials earned, enrollment in post-secondary education, that's data that can be collected from the partners and reported back to juvenile justice systems without relying on being able to track down and get individual youth and young adults to respond to surveys about course completion. But even acknowledging those challenges, what we saw was that only 20 states were tracking whether enrollment in post-secondary education was achieved, 17 states around employment, 16 states around enrollment in a job training program. And so what we're seeing is that for youth who are returning to community or youth who are leaving community supervision, it wasn't clear to states whether the programs that they had selected and the services provided were successful, were achieving the goals that would define success for this population. And that made it extremely difficult to make really key decisions around what services to provide, whether partnerships are working, whether the needs of the youth are being met. Without being able to answer these key questions, a lot of state agencies were essentially flying blind and hoping that they and also in how services were selected, where rather than using outcome data or youth engagement surveys or partnerships with the employment community to identify what services and what educational services were going to have the most impact. It was what staff were available and what staff had interest in. And that might wind up being the right service, and it might be a really high quality service, but states couldn't answer that. And where they really couldn't answer that was on the statewide system. So maybe one facility was really successful, but another facility was not having the same success and having those partnerships and bringing in high quality services. And one thing we talk about in juvenile justice reform is trying to avoid justice by geography, where having a youth who comes from one part of the state is able to access really high quality services, whereas a youth in another is unable to access those. They are able to access high quality services that meet their needs. So on the next slide. So based off the survey, as well as conversations with both states and local jurisdictions, key stakeholders in the field, such as CJJA, Advanced CTE. We also spoke with Business Roundtable to get a sense of what are some policy changes that can be implemented in order to improve outcomes for the population. The first is to really make a commitment. So to establish staff that are dedicated to providing high quality educational services across the state, who are building those partnerships. And an example of that we identified was in Oregon through the Oregon Youth Authority. They actually have 2 statewide education coordinator positions whose job it is to focus on providing education services that assist the youth under the care of OYA in making sure that they're gaining access to high quality education services, that the services build in a way that makes sense, that upon reentry, there is the warm handoff to partnerships that exist to build on those services, that probation case managers have a person who they can turn to if they're looking for educational resources. And so it's very clear that those 2 staff are responsible for the statewide support and thinking through and making sure that the state has a cohesive vision and services for their population. A second potential policy change is increasing access to online learning and other distance-based programming in facilities, but also now in the community as well. So even prior, as I mentioned, to the COVID-19 pandemic, this is something that was really critical in terms of being able to provide access to high quality and a range of services to youth and young adults in the juvenile justice system. And now that is even more true. So really making sure, that access to those services are made available, and that for youth in the community who may not have high-speed internet at home or access to a computer at home, working with partners, working with service providers to provide that support, to think through how can we get a tablet or a jetpack in order to allow that youth to be able to access distance-based learning programs to support them during this time when they're maybe not able to come in to a community-based organization or to attend a school, but make sure that they're being provided the support and services necessary to be able to access that distance-based programming. A third policy recommendation is around ensuring that services provided to youth in facilities are in line with state education and CTE standards. One of the really worrying things we saw in the locked out report was that many states were not ensuring that the education was being provided met statewide CTE standards. So it wasn't the auditing process or the quality assurance process to really make sure it was high quality services. While some progress has been made since 2015 on those standards, we once again we're seeing in the survey that hasn't come as far as it needs to, as well as that many systems weren't looking at statewide CTE standards for their career and technical education programs or the workforce development services, and looking to those state standards to make sure that what's being provided is really meeting the highest standards and what's being provided to this community. Fourth recommendation is around providing support to youth around higher education applications and identifying funding supports. So discussed Second Chance Pell earlier in this conversation, but in general, just thinking through collateral consequences. Oftentimes, when applying for school, it can ask questions about whether a youth has ever been arrested before, come into contact with the justice system, and helping youth understand and providing support around that doesn't mean you shouldn't apply. In many cases, due to case ceilings, you don't even have to answer yes to those questions when applying for federal funding. Looking at whether it's a drug conviction or not, a different kind of conviction, helping youth and providing support and understanding when going through those applications so they're not doing it on their own, because it can be very confusing. And then identifying for those youth who have collateral consequences that may make state financial aid or federal financial aid not an option, thinking through what those additional resources are and helping them identify such as Second Chance Pell. And then a final recommendation around educational services is around improving data collection and reporting to better allow for outcome data to guide real-time decision-making around programming and services. So rather than oftentimes you hear of data as sort of being a file cabinet, or maybe data goes in but is not being pulled out, is not being utilized to guide decision-making, identify some key data outcomes that are closely tied to what success is. And so if you are identifying success as linking with a youth back with their home school or engaging in higher education, having really clearly defined outcome data that answers those questions of whether that's successful or not, and reporting on that in a consistent way that allows for real-time decision-making. So rather than being able to do a post-research project 3 or 4 years in the past, being able to say, here's our last 6 months of data, what does that mean for the year going forward? And for some of that data that will be difficult for a juvenile justice system to collect, really working with those partnerships such as community colleges or state and local education boards to get some of that data back so that those services can be tracked and those outcomes can be tracked without relying on following up and individual reporting from youth who come to the system. So I will now turn it over to Susan Lockwood to discuss some of her experiences both at Indiana as well as at CEA in terms of this field. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity to join in this conversation around partnerships and youth transition. As Jacob said before, I am Susan Lockwood-Roberts, and I was the Director of Juvenile Education for the Indiana Department of Correction for 12 years until I retired back in 2017. And so what I'm here today to do today is to just talk a little bit about how we worked on developing partnerships in Indiana. Next slide, please. So when I first assumed my administrative position inside DOC in the schools, one thing I needed to note is that the Indiana Department of Correction as an agency runs the schools and our juvenile correctional facilities. So we are not connected in to a school district of any kind. We're running the schools as an agency. And so one of the very most important things that how we viewed our role was that we were supposed to be bridging between the Department of Correction and the public schools so that the youth could be able to easily transition back to his public school once he finished at DOC. But what we started to find out over the years was that that's not always the best solution for a youth, especially those youth who are older and undercredited, like Jacob spoke of earlier. And so what we started to do was think about what other entities we could work with to help these youth get to the place they needed to be. And so this conversation actually started to grow as the federal grants funding that we received, some of the outcome measures we had to report on started to become a little more involved in some of the things we had to do as far as involving our stakeholders in decision making, basically caused us to have to work more with other agencies. And so as we started to do that, we started to talk with each other about some of our shared outcome measures and tried to think about how it might work that we could help each other with this reporting that was mandatory for the federal funding that we were receiving. Next slide. So one of the things that we found was through the Department of Workforce Development, with their funding, they had outcome measures that they needed to report on. And through Title I, Part D, Subpart 1, the funding that we were receiving to help supplement what we were doing with our youth, we found out that our outcomes in some ways overlapped with each other. And so at that point, we started looking at opportunities to work together and see how it could be that we could help each other achieve the outcomes that we needed. And as it often goes, as you achieve outcomes and you're able to reflect positive growth in some of those areas, it sometimes impacts the amount of funding that you get. And so that was kind of a key incentive for both of our agencies. Next slide, please. So what were some of those outcome measures? One, for when we were looking at the workforce development, Department of Workforce Development in Indiana, they were particularly interested in how to connect with out-of-school youth. Once a student is enrolled in a public school, he's on the radar. People can, the Department of Ed knows where this student is, where he's attending school and that kind of thing. But if a youth has not enrolled in public school after leaving incarceration, it's really hard to know how to find him. And so we started talking about ways that the people at Workforce Development could connect with these out-of-school youth. And one of those ways was to connect with us, because we had students who could potentially be in that demographic. So we started talking a little bit about that, and we said with the workforce people, they said that they can, they offered that they could connect the youth to adult education programming, that obviously they could connect them with job training and employment. The other thing about this is that our Department of Workforce Development is tightly connected to our statewide community college system. And so they also work very closely with the community college system to make sure that various employment certifications are directly linked to specific needs within regions around the state. And so naturally, if one of our youth was going back to a certain region in the state, it would be most beneficial for him to be connected with workforce development, because that agency could help him connect to the job training programs that would most likely lead to employment. So that was all of those kinds of things became part of this conversation about how is the best way to transition our youth. So with the Department of Correction, with our Title I outcome reporting, we were supposed to be reporting things such as the number of re-enrollments in public school, the number of high school credits that were earned, the number of high school graduates, the number of students enrolled in post-secondary, the number of students employed, and the number of students completing career technical courses. So a lot of that can happen inside the Department of Correction, but once if we were able to get them enrolled in public school, we often were not able to track and know what some of these other outcomes were. And so we started to think about what we could do and how we could coordinate all of this so it just made the most sense for each of our youth. Next slide, please. Another program that is under the administration of our Department of Workforce Development is actually for in-school youth, and it's called Jobs for America's Graduates. And Jobs for America's Graduates is a state-based national nonprofit organization, and it works primarily with youth who have a lot of challenges and life experience that makes it difficult for them to achieve success. And often these youth would be youth who might drop out of school or would have that potential. And so it's not a class that a youth takes for credit in high school, but it's set up in the high schools, most of the high schools in Indiana, where these youth would go to a class every day where they would meet with an adult who basically helps guide them through all of the things that they need to have assistance with. It could be things such as just navigating school in general. It can be learning how to do job interviews, do things that are related to what often people refer to as soft skills, where, you know, learning about what it's like to have a job and to hold a job. There's all kinds of activities that have to do with interviewing, with visiting colleges, with applying to colleges or post-secondary, applying for jobs, just all kinds of things. And the best thing about JAG is that most are up to 95% of these youth who probably would have dropped out of school are actually graduating from high school. And so this is a really important and successful program in the state of Indiana. And so we really thought that since the Department of Workforce Development was administering the program, that we should also look at how we could connect our youth who are returning to high school to a JAG program. Next slide, please. So as we started thinking about all of it and trying to figure out the best way to make it all work together with our friends at the Department of Workforce Development, we basically came up with a different plan that seemed to be a little bit unique, because up until that point, our biggest goal was to try to get a youth re-enrolled in public school. But then, like I said, we started saying that, or seeing that it was made more sense to really try to think about what the youth actually needed and wanted to do and what would be the best path for him to get there. And so we used our Title I funding. We continued to use it to have a transition coordinator in each one of our facility schools, but we also hired a statewide transition coordinator who could help make sure that everything was on point, especially, you know, if kids were getting transferred from one school to another, to help make sure that things stayed coordinated with, you know, within our agency across all the schools, that things were consistent. So we did that. And the other thing that we did as far as assigning dedicated staff, we actually used our teachers. And our teachers basically had a caseload of students, probably between 8 to 10 students, that they would be assigned to work with throughout that student's enrollment in our schools. And during that time, the teacher would conduct 6 different transition interviews with that student at various times throughout his stay with us. And each one of those transition interviews covered a different topic, so that by the end, the student had a transition plan and could say that he wanted to, for example, go back to his community and connect with an adult education program that would lead to a post-secondary job training certificate, that kind of thing. So that's what we did. We had the transition interviews with the teachers. Those transition plans were basically presented as the plan that the student would follow. Our transition coordinators would work with the student at the time of reentry to help get him connected to, instead of connecting them to a public school, would connect them to the regional youth director at the Department of Workforce Development. And that regional Department of Workforce Development staff member was very critical in this process, because that person would then work with the youth, and if the youth is out of school, he would have these options that are listed here on the screen. If he was an out of school youth, he would be directed or helped to connect to an adult education program, a job training program, employment, or post-secondary enrollment, or maybe a couple of those based on whatever the need was. Next slide, please. If the student needed to be enrolled in public school, if it made the most sense to get him back into his community public school, the DWD staff member would help him enroll in the public school. And also, especially important, if the public school had a JAG program, he would be able to help get the student connected to the JAG program, which we thought would be very critical for him as well to continue to be successful. And so it's really important to note that we had a lot of things kind of in play here with the two agencies. We had to train our teachers to do the transition interviews with the students and help them come up with their transition plan by the time they were ready to re-enter. On the flip side, our Department of Workforce Development staff had to be trained in knowing more about our youth as they were coming back, and to be able to help them understand what options there were for those youth and how to best direct them based on their plan. Next slide, please. So one other factor, one other partnership that was going on alongside of all of this, the Hope Mentoring Program, that we worked on and established through a partnership with Indiana University. So Indiana University has satellite campuses all around the state, and so they had satellite campuses near each one of our correctional facilities. And so we started small, and the mentoring program was established using undergraduate and graduate students at IU who went through training to, a very comprehensive training about mentoring. And the mentors worked with the youth during and after incarceration. So they would come and visit the youth. There would be career fairs, dress your best events, mock interviews, things like that as far as large events. But then they would also just do some one-on-one mentoring with the youth during incarceration, and then would follow the youth after incarceration to help him kind of navigate some of the things that he encountered upon re-entry. And so one of the things that's important to note about all of this is that it was also, we were able to support some positions to put some coordination to the HOPE mentoring program. We supported that with Title I Part D funding as well. And so the goal right now is to grow this HOPE mentoring program so that each of our students has a mentor. Right now, at this point, that's not totally, we haven't met that goal, but we have strong HOPE mentoring programs in each of the 3 juvenile facilities in our state. So I'm going to leave it right here and open it up for questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Susan. There were a couple of questions just before we get into a more general discussion. The first was just about how youth were referred to the JAG, which I think you covered a little bit. But then is it asked if it was possible to have a youth recently released from a juvenile facility into JAG that is over the age of 18?
I believe there are a small number of out-of-school JAG programs for youth, but the one thing about JAG, I believe, is that they have an extra year to complete high school if they needed to. So I don't think that it matters if the student is over the age 18.
Thank you. And the second JAG specific question was, does JAG incorporate access to mental health services or a mentor knowledgeable in disability accommodations to assist in job placement?
Again, what I would say is that the JAG specialist that's assigned to each school works with all of the youth, and as that person is directly tied with Department of Workforce Development as well, I think that that specialist would be able to seek out the resources necessary to help connect the youth who needed those resources. So if there were some mental health resources needed or some special accommodations that needed to be made to help connect them with employment, those resources would be available through DWD and through JAG.
Thank you so much for that presentation and for covering those questions. As we move into a more discussion portion, I encourage everyone on the line to please send in your questions via the chat box about anything that you have, any questions you might have about either the presentations, as the discussion occurs, to any of the answers to the discussion questions, or just general thoughts or questions that you have that we didn't cover that you would like to ask about. Additionally, I'd also like to welcome Lucas to the conversation. As was mentioned, Lucas Yak oversees and helps run education programs and serves as the principal at Lighthouse Academy in Michigan and can speak from an education partner perspective. He can give a little bit of background about the work that he does once we get started, but I think it will provide a really important viewpoint and set of experiences to support the discussion. Even though it's not actually the first question that's on the screen right now, I do think it would be remiss to not touch on some of the ways that COVID and the current pandemic is impacting the ability to provide educational services. So I was wondering if Susan, from your position, having the unique perspective of getting to work both with Indiana and then seeing what's happening nationally at CEA, if you could provide some things that you're hearing from your members about some of the challenges as well as strategies of meeting the educational needs of this population during the pandemic. And then Lucas, if you wanted to add, what is happening in your school and what you all are doing to meet some of these challenges given the current time in the world.
So I know from not only juvenile, but also adults adult correctional facilities where we often have youth incarcerated as well. Obviously, it's been a huge challenge if there's no access to digital learning, and specifically either youth are having to do their work via packets or work that's being taken into them, because staffing in a lot of places is very limited as a way to protect the youth from being exposed to the virus. So that is definitely a very key challenge. Another key challenge is that for those facilities where the teachers are able to come in and teach the youth, for whatever reason, when there's social distancing measures that are put into place, often that means that the programming is limited because they have to maybe cut the amount of time that some students are in class so that the other half of the population attends, for example. So maybe half of the population attends in the morning and half of the population attends in the afternoon. And so instead of going to school all day, every day, like they would normally do, their program is limited based on the social distancing requirements. The other thing that I think is really critical to note is that, you know, our youth outside of the fence, you know, people in public schools, most of those students are quarantined and are attending school using distance learning, and that keeps them safe or keeps them safer. And unfortunately for our youth who are incarcerated, they don't have that option. And if they want to go to school, then they're going to school and exposing themselves to a dangerous virus. And so that's what I've been hearing across the country of things that are happening. But I also personally, that's my comment, is that it just doesn't seem fair at all that, you know, some of the most challenged youth are actually exposed to this virus through no fault of their own.
Okay. Lucas?
Yeah, I can echo a little bit what she said with some of those challenges that we are seeing. Is that the technology being a barrier? You know, it's some of the technology that we're able to use, it's so locked down and limited. So we had to be a little more. We had to think a little outside the box as far as how we were going to get everything to the students and how we were going to build our continuum of learning plan. So we do a mixture of packets and then also E2020 Edgenuity online learning so that the students can continue with their education. We provided the juvenile detention through those Title I-D funds with the detention center, the school in there. We had already purchased some new Chromebooks for them to utilize when they were in those Edgenuity classes. So we redistributed some other Chromebooks in different areas to be able to have as many on hand, but we still wanted them to be able to do some packet work. So we also set up a plan where the teachers, and this is in collaboration and lots of meetings, lots of communication with our community partner, the juvenile detention itself, where we came up with a plan on what units certain teachers were going to call, and then they were able to do weekly and biweekly check-ins with students and provide that discussion, granted not face-to-face, but have those over-the-phone discussions to try to help them with their education. We were able to work out a system where the school leader there was able to come in weekly and collect any packet work that was finished and provide new packet work for those who are there. As students came in, that was another barrier that we ran into, is the new students that came in. We weren't able to get transcripts on them because most of the other schools in the area have their central offices closed, or they didn't have access to get to that to send the transcripts. So we really focused for those new students on those short-term learning gaps that they may face. A lot of our students, when they come in, we see them facing gaps in the math and reading areas, as we all know. So we really have an advisory class that's set aside, even when we're in face-to-face learning, that has shown its value really throughout this time. So we give a pre-assessment, and then we find out where their gaps are, what those standards are that they're missing that they need to work on in those areas, and that can be a great focus for them. So one of the real big blessings throughout this whole COVID process is that now that we've developed and we continue to tune the system, we have a plan in place that we might see another flare up in the fall, winter, whatever, and we might need to go into a 14-day lockdown where we're not able to get the teachers in the building again. We can directly go into this system, into this process. We know what we're going to do, so that we'll at least be able to provide some sort of an education. The other situation falls in line if we have, so we're from Michigan, so just last year we had the old Snowmageddon in January, which the state of emergency was announced, and we were shut down for a week, where we weren't allowed to go to the juvenile detention to provide their education. Just the staff of the facility was there. So if something like that is in place, we have this now distance learning norm that we can always fall into, so that we can provide some sort of continued education for the students that are in the facility.
And thank you so much for that, Lucas. I think I want to just build off of that, the silver linings of some of the situation. Oftentimes it can be a real challenge to meet the needs in the community of youth who are in rural areas or in states that are more geographically separated, and being able to take advantage of the lessons learned from this opportunity about how to improve distance-based learning and how to get tools and services into the hands of youth, so that they don't have to be in a space every single day in order to benefit from services. And then another thing we're hearing is we had some conversations with the Department of Labor, and heard that WIOA is considering there's usually a place-based restriction around access to online learning. So if the state is going to pay for services that are provided online, the provider still has to have a physical presence within the state, that those restrictions are going to either happen or are going to get relaxed. I forget exactly where in the process that they are, so that WIOA funds, if you are connected to your WIOA board and able to access those, can be utilized to provide distance-based services to youth, both in the facilities as well as in the community. And it can be the best available across the country. They don't have to have that physical presence within the state anymore in order to be able to access those funds. So there are some real opportunities to leverage some of the lessons learned around being able to access new services, being able to access new programs, and being able to utilize this moving forward to better serve this population. As we continue to move forward in the discussion, I do want to encourage getting a number of questions and want to get to those as well. But as we move to the more generalized discussion questions, also want to say that that's a real opportunity for you all to also think through some answers and post and ask questions of them. You can see the first discussion question up on the screen right now around just some of the key challenges in utilizing education partnerships. And when we get to that, think through what are the things that are happening in your jurisdiction that you're working with, to either provide examples that we can then share back with everyone else listening, or to get feedback from some of the panelists about the strategies that you're engaging with. But before we get to that discussion question, I do want to make sure we're addressing the questions that we have already received. So one of the questions was to Susan, if any of the facilities, either in Indiana or nationally that you've seen, able to utilize CARES Act funds for instruction use, or if Lucas, as you know, that's happening in Michigan.
I haven't heard of that yet. We've been having some directors calls every week, CEA state directors calls. And so that is something that I can pose to them and just kind of get a sense of it. They haven't brought up CARES Act. They're more concerned at this point, they seemed to be more concerned with how to keep their Pell ESI programming going in the adult facilities, and the juvenile facilities were very concerned about just trying to make sure their students were able to get services. So those were the priorities, and nobody really mentioned the CARES Act.
In some
I know,
of the,
Lucas, you're. Oh, go ahead,
Yep.
Lucas.
Yep, in some of the conversations that have come up, both with the juvenile detention that we provide education for, as well as the adult Kent County Jail, they have been working with conversations towards with getting some CARES Act funds. And then I know the school also will be provided some CARES Act funds. The issue with the school is because of the overall budget cut to education. Some of that CARES Act we're waiting for guidance on how we can use it. It's going to be in there, but there still is a limited amount of guidance as to where it's going to be able to be utilized and how it should be utilized. I know the jail has reached out to us specifically and said, hey, is there any technology needs that you have that we can cover with some of the CARES Act for the guys in the jail?
Thank you both. And I think another question sort of building around being able to utilize funding and how to support these services. Do any of the public schools assist using Title IV funds to help students in transition to public school or professional development?
Yes, I think some are more connected to Title IV funding with their local school districts. I think again, that's a great partnership that needs to be pursued. There are school districts that are, let me put it this way, there are correctional facilities that exist within the geographical boundary of school districts who really work well together, and they offer to include them in Title V funding for technology, Title II funding for professional development. And so those partnerships are definitely worth pursuing.
And I think the tenor of these questions, actually, we can just move to this next slide right now. The second discussion question is around leveraging resources and what resources would be the most helpful. So thinking through, both financial resources, some of those partnerships like you mentioned, Susan, or utilization of ESSA, but also what sort of tools are the most helpful in supporting improved educational partnerships, both from what you've seen in Indiana as well as the CEA, and then Lucas, from your perspective, what has been the most helpful for you all in Michigan in terms of those resources and tools to support the services and partnership?
What I've observed is that it makes a huge difference if you can, as an education administrator, if you can become involved in some of the state agency task forces for some of their the initiatives that other state agencies have, because often they need to have various stakeholders as part of their task force. And so when you become part of their task force, you start to learn more about what their objectives are. And that helps you maybe think about how your own objectives align to theirs. And then that's where you can start to see ways that you can work together, either through sharing funding or sharing resources or helping each other achieve outcomes. And lots of times you might have mutual outcomes that you're trying to, you're both trying to get to the same place. And so, like I said, I just think starting to become involved in some of those task forces within other agencies can be very, very helpful.
Yeah, and I agree with that thought. Is from the education standpoint, we have really tried to place ourselves at the service overall. What can we do? We're here to do the job of education, but overall, we're here to try to help provide any tools possible to our students and to the youth to help them when they're to have another tool in their tool belt when they leave the facility. So getting involved in those discussions, that open communication and collaboration with the partner, the funding discussions have led us to different areas along the lines of, we do academic school education pieces Monday through Thursday, our standpoint, but then utilization of those funds, those Title 1D funds, to bring in, they call them the Friday school staff, which is the social emotional. They work on those kind of guiding points on how to develop them and help with their transition out of the programs, as well as the connections that the school has, and using those with the jail and the detention centers to get the career readiness. That's how we also have the JAG program we call Job for Michigan graduates, in connection with another program, which is Project North Star, which is connected with some WIO funds. And they actually put together a plan amongst all of us where they use that case manager, and then when they leave, we opened up a community school program where we're able to press them over into there to help with that, the ability to stop that recidivism rate or cut it down, where then while they're there, they can continue their education. They meet with their POs and all the other stakeholders that are involved right there in that centralized location while they're doing school, as well as the program is able to get them employment, which then through the grant funds, they're able to provide to actually pay for it. So we make these different partnerships with different businesses that are aware of the background possibilities of some of our students, but we those resources and keep those partnerships going with open communication, collaboration, and planning.
And I think, one of the questions we got with Susan when you were talking about the JAG was, can you describe in more detail the role of the transition coordinator within JAG? And I want to give you a chance to answer that question, but I think that also highlights some of what you both are talking about, of the critical role of just the transition process and the partnerships necessary to make that something that, rather than putting it on the youth and young adults going through this process, to put it back on systems to make sure that those transitions are happening smoothly and effectively in a way that supports services. So, Susan, if you want to describe a little bit more about the role of transition coordinator within the JAG specifically, but then if you both want to speak, to the point that some of what you just made about the larger importance of utilizing those partnerships to really ensure that the onus of making sure a smooth transition is happening and that this population is supported falls back on systems rather than on the youth within the system.
So I might need to clarify just a little bit. Our transition coordinator through the Department of Correction would be communicating with the Department of Workforce Development's regional director, youth director, and that youth director would help connect the youth to a JAG program if that was necessary. And so, so as far as the transition piece, those individuals would be the ones that would help transition the youth into a JAG program. Then once the youth gets into a JAG program, there is an adult who is called a JAG specialist who is in that classroom with the youth enrolled in JAG, and every day they see that those youth and do various activities that are related to keeping the youth in school and helping them build their future, basically, whether that be finishing high school and getting employed, or finishing high school and enrolling in college, whatever that is, that's what the JAG specialist would be doing inside the public school where this student is enrolled. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but maybe gave it more clarity to how that all worked.
And we have a similar model. We have a transitions coordinator through the school that works on college career readiness and just overall transition into even when they're transitioning to another K-12 school outside the juvenile detention or jail. But they are working because of our JAG specialist comes right to us, and transition coordinator is working with the JMG specialist and program as to finding which students, those long-term students, are going to be more appropriate. So we have certain that we know are going to be in the facility for more than 3 months. That's normally around a 3-month program to be able to get your soft job skills, career readiness, that the actual in-class necessities done. And then when they leave the facility, the transition coordinator stays in contact with the JMG specialist, who then also is continuously doing the follow-up services when that youth leaves the facility. And so they have a report card that they need to check off, which is after however many months did the youth acquire employment, have they successfully graduated after high school, after so long, and other areas where they're checking off their lists. And that's just open communication with that transition coordinator in order to keep our reports up to date.
Great, thank you both. And this question was specifically about Indiana, but I don't know if Lucas, if you can speak to it in Michigan as well, and then I can speak to it from what we see nationally. But it says, does the legislation in Indiana address requiring students to have a transition plan from a facility back to a public school or other educational options? So is it required by legislation that that's part of the transition plan?
No, it doesn't. The reason we started doing transition plans, we were trying to make transition was a key part of Title I, Part D, Subpart 1. And so being able to, report these positive outcomes and connections for youth was really important. So as that became, a key part of Title I, we wanted to, make as comprehensive of a plan for that as possible. So it wasn't necessarily legislation that did it. It was out of responding to the requirements of Title I.
In Michigan, every student is required to have an EDP, an educational development plan, within 30 days of being part of the program or the school. This is a school standpoint need, and part of that EDP is a transition piece to it, so that there is a requirement that there is transitions goals and plans set up before as soon as they're part of the school. That's not the facility requirement, that's the educational requirement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say just from a national perspective, see it in a variety of different ways. I would say relatively few states in legislation have a specific transition language in terms of requirement. However, in some jurisdictions, just state law around educational requirements have been interpreted to mean that it is required, or probation has it built in to their standards of practice, that's built into the transition plan. So, there's a few different models. I think there's not a ton of specific legislation specifically speaking to transition plans from around education from juvenile justice back into the community, but some jurisdictions have also interpreted general education statute to mean that that is required. So there are a few different models nationally. We have a couple other questions, but I do want to get to the third discussion question and ask, both you, Susan, and you, Lucas, of, do you know the person in your state who is required, to be that for those partnerships to form, who's in charge of those Perkin funds and managing the state block grant or ESSA funds or Title IV? And if you do know, or if you don't, if you could make suggestions of where jurisdictional leaders can look to find who that person is in their state, so how they can make sure that they are reaching out to the right person to make sure that they're forming those partnerships that are necessary to create the programs like you've just described.
I would definitely say that the first thing they need to do is just learn about their adult education program and who administers it. It might be your Department of Education, it might be your Department of Workforce or Department of Labor. And then from there, introduce yourself to that state director and find out, find out more about how you can become part of, of their, their world. Basically, it's really important to have that relationship anyway, since a lot of the youth that we serve end up in an adult education program of some kind. So that's where I would start, is with looking for the adult education, the statewide administrator. And then it could also be that that statewide administrator has a second, staff person that is specifically working with youth programs. So
for us, the contact is through the Michigan Department of Education for all Perkins Fund stuff.
Okay, thank you. And I know that also for some CTE work as well, Advanced CTE has, if you go on their website, they, as the organization that of CTE leaders in states, also has some good information about who to contact and who to reach out to if you are looking to learn more about CTE partnerships and workforce development, which is something we'll talk a little bit more about in the next session as well. And then one last question, I think we're running low on time. I apologize. I think is just, what are some key strategies that you all think jurisdictions can really focus on to improve education partnerships and service capacity within jurisdictions, giving just 2 or 3 things that people can take away in terms of action items that you think that they should be following up on. What do you think some of those keys are?
Again, I think it just goes back to looking at which agencies you do a lot of work with anyway, where your objectives intersect, like adult education or Department of Ed or workforce development, any of those people that you work with anyway, and your job kind of intersects with theirs, then looking to them to just sit down and have some discussion about what their objectives are and how yours align with theirs, and then go from there.
Yeah, it was pretty helpful for us we surveyed the different partners in the area, and we were able to, based on what everyone had said through the surveys, is we were able to identify a theme need for everybody. And then we got the group to the table, we sat down, and we collaborated on how we were able to help one another and what ways that we could all focus our direction to meet the needs that we all obviously had, and therefore better support our community and better support the students and residents.
I have one other quick one, especially like with the Hope mentoring program with IU, that came out of a professor at IU approaching me saying that she wanted to have opportunities for undergrad and graduate students to experience, and get some like practical experience working with our youth. And she was very creative in how to set that up. And so then we were able to together to build what we have now. So again, sometimes universities have objectives that could align very much to what you're trying to accomplish.
Great. And before turning it quickly back over to Wendy and CJJA, I wanted to thank both of you for all of your comments, your presentation. It's been extremely helpful. For anyone who's reaching out, I apologize we weren't able to get to all the questions that were sent in today. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to follow up with myself at CSG. We're looking to partner and work and continue to expand the knowledge base and interest in this work. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation, with COVID, this work is as important now as it has ever been. It's going to be really critical for states and jurisdictions to think through how they're making sure that this is a population that isn't being left behind, is being provided the services necessary to participate in the economic recovery that's coming in a meaningful way. So if you have any more questions, any interest in learning about more, talking about your specific jurisdiction and some of the strategies that can be utilized, please do feel free to reach out. So thank you everyone who's joined, and I'll turn it back over to Wendy.
Thank you, Jacob, and I echo your remarks as well. This was a very informative conversation. What we will do for any questions that were not answered, we will reach out to Susan, Jacob, and Lucas and get that information back to you as soon as possible. So again, I just want to thank our presenters and all of our participants on today's webinar. Make sure you watch your emails for more information on our upcoming webinar. And lastly, if you wouldn't mind, there will be a short survey for you to take upon closing out of the application. If you could complete that survey for us, we'd really like to hear your feedback so we can improve on future webinars. So with that, thank you again for your time. Have a great day. Bye-bye.